In this video, we'll be utilizing a standard material within BabylonJS to add textures to basic 3D objects we created in a previous video. We'll be going over the process of creating these materials, sourcing the texture maps, and then finally applying them to the mesh objects. During the process, we'll also go over some material properties you'll need to be familiar with, such as the UVScale, inverting normal maps, and adjusting the specularity. So with that said, let's start writing some code. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. I wanted to go over a few changes that I made to the CSS from our last video. So I do have this already running, so you can run that with npm run serve. Let's just take a quick look at some of the changes. Okay, so the only thing I changed was the CSS. So I have a canvas now that has a drop shadow, and I also added in some white text for the top here, and then obviously the background here is a grid. So this is the scene that we're going to be using. We're going to reuse this with our current scene that we're going to be going over, which is to add a standard material to things like the sphere and the plane object here. We're going to be going over using a few different types of textures. We're going to be using a place called Polyhaven to grab our textures. But before we do that, let's create out the basic shell of our class, and then we'll take a look at how we can utilize our textures. So let's jump back into the code. Okay, so I'm going to keep my server running, and now in our Babylon examples, we're going to go ahead and open this up. There's our basic scene. Let's create a new file, and we're going to call this standard materials with an S. Now remember, this is a TypeScript file, so we add .ts at the end. Now, what I'm going to do here is actually copy a lot of what we had in our basic scene. I don't want to have to retype this out. We are going to be reusing a lot of the same logic, and I'm just going to be adding to it by adding in materials and textures. So I'm going to go back into my basic scene, Control A and Control C. Now, again, if you want to follow along with this with the same code, I will provide a link to the code repository in the description. Okay, so once again, we'll copy this. Let's go back to our standard materials class and paste it in. Now at the very top, make sure that you do rename the class name to standard materials. Okay, it's going to save that. Now let's go back into our component for the Babylon examples. I'm no longer using the basic scene, so what I'm going to do is actually remove that. And instead, I'm going to import the new class, which is standard materials. And make sure that you're not grabbing this from Babylon. The naming of this class is standard materials with an S. So we're looking for the one that we created. So I'm just going to go ahead and import this myself. So at Babylon examples / standard materials. Make sure that you rename the basic scene down below here as well to standard materials. Okay, now if we save this and we wait for this to reload, if we go back to the localhost 8080, we should see the exact same thing. Okay, and there we go. Now we have the exact same thing. We can also rename this to standard materials, but I think I'm going to keep it as is for now. Okay, now before we take a look at the materials and the textures in our class, let's go ahead and download a few different textures. Now, a great place to find free textures and even HDRIs or models is Polyhaven. Now, Polyhaven has a bunch of free textures we're going to be using. We are going to be using the standard material, which has different types of textures we can use. Now, a lot of these are geared towards PBR, which is not something I really want to use for the standard material, but there are a few materials in here that we can use, or textures rather, that we can use for the standard material. So let's take a look at some of these. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And I do have these opened up already in separate tabs, but the first one we're looking for is under the metal section. So it's going to be this one right here, the metal plate, which is this guy right here. The second one is going to be the cobblestone. So if I go back to all, they should be at the very bottom. Okay, so it's going to be cobblestone 05. All right, so let's take a look at the first one. Now, this one right here has a number of different textures. And when we're dealing with the standard material, there are a few different textures we are going to be using. Some of these we're not going to be using. Some of these are specific to PBR. So the first one we're going to download is AO. Now, AO stands for Ambient Occlusion. This is going to allow us to see all the kind of shadows along the edges here. So if I take a look at this first map, you can see it says AO, click on it. This is the ambient occlusion. So it's going to be black and white. It's grayscale, and we can see all these little kind of gray areas. That is what ambient occlusion does. So it's going to make our texture look a little bit cleaner, a little bit more realistic because it has those nice little shadows. So we need to download this, and I'm going to download the JPEG version, and I'm using a 1K resolution. Okay, this is going to open up in a separate tab. Let's just go ahead and right click on it and save image as. For the time being, I'm just going to save these on my desktop, but I don't want this long name. So what I'm going to do is just call it metal_AO. Okay, let's repeat this process for the other texture maps we're going to be using. So we have a bump texture in here. There is a bump texture within the standard material, but we're actually going to be using the normal map for that. So let's go ahead and download that as well. And I'm going to kind of speed through this. I don't want you to just watch me downloading these. Okay, so we're going to save that one as well. The next one is going to be the diffuse. The diffuse is going to be our basic color map. And the last one we're going to take a look at is the specular. Now, the specular is going to be specific to the standard material. You'll see that we also have the roughness. Now, the roughness may do something similar, but it actually works in conjunction with a metal map. Now, these are for PBR, so we're not going to be using these. We're going to use the specular map instead. So again, we need the specular map, normal, AO, and diffuse. And we're using the JPEG versions of these maps. Okay, now while we're here, let's also go down to our cobblestone. So I'll close these up. So I have the cobblestone already opened up, and we want to get the same textures that we had for the metal plate. So AO, diffuse, normal, and spec. Okay, so I'm done downloading all the textures that I need. So once you have all the textures that you need, you can close this up, and we'll jump back into our code. Okay, let's jump back into our standard materials class. And what I want to do here is actually have a section in here for all the textures we're going to be using. I'm actually going to be using the public folder here. So in there, we're going to create a new folder called textures. And within there, we're going to create two different folders, one for the stone and one for the metal. So stone and then metal. Now from there, I'm going to take all the texture maps that I downloaded and I'm going to drag them into each one of these folders. Okay, so let's make sure that we grab all the metal ones. So metal diffuse, AO, normal, and spec. We'll drag this into the metal folder. We'll repeat that for the stone. Make sure you put those in the stone folder. And there we go. So we should have a total of 4 maps per folder. So AO, diffuse, normal, and specular. All right, so we're going to start off by creating a material. If we take a look at our current class, we have the create scene, which allows us to create both the mesh objects of ground and the ball. Now, I want to be able to assign a material to these. And what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 separate methods for creating each one of the materials for both the metal and the stone, or in this case, the ball and the ground. Now, the ground is going to have the stone texture, and the ball is going to have the metal texture. So right below the ball.position, I'm going to add in 2 sections here for assigning a material to both the ball and the ground. Let's start off with the ground first. I'm going to say ground.material, and here we can assign a material. And with this, I'm going to create a method that returns a standard material. The standard material is going to be assigned to ground.material. So I'm going to say this dot create ground material. Now it's going to complain because I haven't actually created this yet, which is fine. Let's do the same thing for the ball. So ball.material, create ball material. Now, right below this method, let's create our 2 methods for creating the ground material and the ball material. And we're just going to create an empty method for both of these for now, so it stops complaining about this. So let's start off with the ground material. Now remember, this is going to be returning a standard material. And make sure that you have standard material without the S. We don't want to be using our class. This is coming from BabylonJS. Now it is going to complain. You can see it did try to use my class, which is not ideal, but in this case, that's the name we're going with. So we have standard material here. This is coming from BabylonJS core. Make sure that you select that one. Okay, and in here it's going to complain because we're not returning anything yet. What I'm going to do is copy this. I'll create the second method. And this will be the ball material. All right, let's start off with the ground material first. We'll focus on the ball material afterwards. So for the ground material, I want to use these stone textures that we have in our textures folder. So the first thing I want to do is actually create the material, and then we create the textures and assign the textures to the material. The material then gets assigned to the respective object that we have assigned up here. So ground.material will be equal to whatever we return out of the ground material here. Let's create a variable at the very top, and we're just going to call this ground mat. It doesn't really matter what you call it here, because up here, we're just going to be returning whatever we get out of here. So that's just for our own personal preference here. Const ground mat will be equal to a new center material. Okay, we provide a name. So I'm just going to call this ground mat. And then we need to assign it to this dot scene. And while we're here, let's go and return ground mat. Even though we don't have anything in there, let's go and return it anyways. Now it's going to stop complaining about returning the center material. Okay, let's continue with this. Now we need to create our textures. So we're going to be creating a diffuse, normal, spec, and AO. So for each one of our textures, we're going to create a separate texture in our code. We're then going to assign that to the material. Now, the reason why I'm going to be doing this separately is because of the UVScale. There is a bit of a weird issue with the UVScale, which I'll explain in a moment. But let's just start off with our very first texture. So to create a texture, it's going to create a variable, and I'm just going to call this diffuse text. That's going to be equal to a new texture. This is a class, and this takes in a string. So that is going to be the URL of where this is located. So this is going to be in our public textures stone folder. And the way we would access that is by saying dot slash, and then we say textures slash stone slash, and then the name of the texture. So I'm looking for the diffuse texture. That's going to be stone underscore diffuse.jpg. We also need to assign it to this .scene. And it looks like it didn't actually import this. If we take a look at the very top, we don't actually have that in there. So I'm just going to go and type that in. Texture. Okay, now it's complaining because we're not using this quite yet. So the reason why I'm creating these textures separately, we don't have to create them separately, is because I want to be able to modify the UVScale. So we'll take a look at the UVScale in a moment, but let's just see if we can actually apply a material to our ground with this diffuse texture first. So the way that we assign a texture to a material is by referencing the material. So ground mat dot, and what do I want to use? Well, I want to use the diffuse texture. So diffuse, and you can see that we have diffuse color and diffuse texture. Now we can use both of these in conjunction, meaning that if I want to apply a tint, I would have a texture and the diffuse color. So you'll see this kind of set up with a few different types of properties in our material, which we'll take a look at later on. But for the diffuse texture, I want to use the diffuse text that we created up here. So I'm going to set that equal to diffuse text. Okay, so now we have the texture attached to the material, and we're returning material here, which is then being assigned up here. So if I save this, and it's going to complain down here, I think for now, what I'm going to do is just comment this out. And let's jump back up at the very top. Let's do the same thing up here. We'll take a look at the ball material in a moment. So we'll wait for this to recompile. Let's jump back into the browser. Okay, so here we are in the browser. If I move around with my mouse, you can see that the texture has been applied. It does look a little bit dark, and that has really nothing to do with the texture itself, but more the lighting. When we use the basic scene, we actually reduce the hemispheric lighting down by half. So we set it to 0.5. And we're also going to be modifying the camera as well, because I do want to be able to move around. One thing I didn't go over in the first video was how we can actually move around with the mouse and the arrow keys with this camera. So if I use the arrow keys, I can move around. And you can see it's very, very fast. So we need to be able to slow that down quite a bit so that I can get in close to, say, the sphere or the ground without shooting through it or flying around. So let's modify the lighting and also the camera as well. Then we'll continue with the rest of our textures. Okay, so going back into our code, let's scroll up a bit. First off, we want to adjust the hemispheric light intensity. So right now it's set to 0.5. Let's bump this up to 1, which I believe is the default, but we'll leave this in here as is. I'll save that real quick. And now at the very top right here where we have the camera, we've attached the control, but I want to modify the speed of the camera. So to do that, I'm going to say camera.speed, and this is a number. By default, I believe it's set to 1. So let's bring this down to 0.25. Okay, let's go back into the browser and let's see how this works. Okay, so here we are in the browser. As you can tell, everything is much, much brighter, which is good. I can move around with my mouse still. And if I use the arrow keys, you can see it's a lot smoother. So I'm not going to be shooting through these objects anymore. I can get up quite close. I can look down, so on and so forth. Now, if you see it disappear, that's perfectly fine. That is the clipping of the camera. That means we're too close. Okay, now as you can tell, this texture right here is quite large. I want to go over how we can adjust the tiling, and that's why I created the texture separately, and I'll go over why that is in a moment. So let's jump back into our code. Okay, so we're back in our ground material method, and what I want to do now is adjust the sizing or the tiling of the diffuse texture. Now, the diffuse texture has something called UVs. UVs are basically the X and Y of the texture itself. So I want to adjust the scaling of both of these together. That way we have the uniform scaling. So to do this, we need to reference the texture individually. So I say diffuse text dot, and I say UVScale. And we need to set this to a number. So I'll start off with a value of say 4. Let's also do the VScale. And we want to make sure that we're using the same value for both of these. Now, you don't always have to do this. If you just want to stretch it out along one specific axis, say the x-axis or the y-axis, you can just leave one out. But I want to scale this uniformly, so I'll go with the value of 4 for both of these. Now, if I save this, we'll jump back into the browser and we'll see the difference it makes. Okay, so now it looks much, much better. It doesn't look too large, it doesn't look too small. Now, one of the downsides to using the UVScale is that you need to do this for every single texture. And if you do this for one texture, you need to do it for all of them. So if I were to adjust the diffuse texture, but I don't adjust the normal map, I'll see the normal map poking out in different areas because the scaling is different than the diffuse texture. So you need to make sure that these all match. And for that, we're going to make this a little bit easier on ourselves by using a for each loop to go through each one of our textures and adjust the scaling uniformly using the exact same values. So we're going to start that off by creating an array. Okay, so we're not going to do this anymore. I'll remove that. What I'm going to do here is right above our texture, I'm going to create a couple more variables. We're going to have one for the UVScale, the number that we want to use for both the U and the V scale. And then we're also going to create an array. So I'll start off with the UVScale. I'm calling it UVScale. This is going to be a number type, and I'll set that equal to a value of 4 to start off. Down below that, we're going to create an array. So this is going to be our texture array, and I'm just going to call it text array for short. And in this case, I am going to be providing a type because I could actually assign this to an empty array as such, but I don't want to do that because if I hover over the text array, you'll see that it has a type of any. So anything can go into this array. I don't want that. I just want a texture array. So to do that, we're going to define the type right here. And the way that you define an array of types is by specifying the type first. That's going to be texture. And then you provide the empty array after that. So now if I hover over this, let me go and save this real quick. If I hover over text array, now it's only using an array of textures. So I can't assign anything else to that. So we're going to be using this array here to loop through all of our textures and then do the same thing that we did down below for the UV scale of our diffuse texture. Now, after we create each texture, we're then going to assign it to the array and also assign it to the ground mat, just like we did down below here. So I'm going to do this right after I assign it to the material. I'm going to say text array dot push, and we're going to push in the diffuse texture. So diffuse text. At the end, we'll use the for each loop to adjust the UV scale. So we're going to repeat this process down below. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here and just swap out what I need. So we're going to have one for the diffuse texture. Let's go down the line. I'm going to go down with the normal, then the AO, and then the spec. Okay, so normal text. This will be a new texture, and we're going to be using the stone normal. We're going to assign it to our ground material. Now, this one's a little bit different because we're not using a normal texture for this. We're actually using something called a bump texture. So within the ground map, we'll look for bump, and this is a bump texture. So we're going to assign the normal text. Next, we're going to then assign it to the array. Let's create the AO. So again, AO is the ambient occlusion, and this is actually for the ambient texture of our material. So I'm just going to call it AO text. So stone.ao.jpg. We're assigning it to AO text. So ambient texture is going to be our AO text, text array.push. And then we want to assign AO text, or we want to push AO text in there rather. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the specular. Now the specular is going to look like this. The roughness map is going to look quite different, but they basically do the same things. The roughness map works with the metallic map, and that's typically used in a PBR environment. With more traditional materials, older materials, they use a specular map. So if we take a look at this, all the black portions here are essentially going to be the areas that are more black, more diffuse. They're not going to reflect light. All the lighter portions will reflect light, so you'll see a bit of shine here. Now, anything that's pure white is essentially going to be reflecting the most light. So we're not really getting a whole lot of reflection in here, but we do want to have some in there. So let's add that in last. Okay, so stone_spec. And with the specular, just like a lot of other properties, you'll see that we have a specular color, specular power, and we also have a specular texture. So we can fine tune the specularity of this map using the specular power and the specular color. We're just going to focus on the specular texture for now, and we'll come back and take a look at the power next. Okay, so now we have all four of our textures applied to the material. So again, let's go up to the very top and review this. So we have our diffuse texture, that is our color map. We're assigning it to the material, and we're also assigning it to the array. We're pushing it in there. Same thing for the normal map. We're going to be pushing the normal map into the text array as well. Same thing for the AO text and the spec text. So make sure that you assign all of these to the material. Now, with all that done, let's take a look at what we have so far. Now, note, we haven't adjusted anything in terms of the UV scale. Okay, so everything looks quite big. And if you zoom out a bit, you can actually see that it looks kind of realistic. And that's because of the normal map. It's creating these like little crevice shadows here. It creates small details. Now, it doesn't deform the geometry like a height map would, but it looks fairly good for the most part. Okay, once all of our textures have been pushed into the text array, we're going to use a for each. So text array dot for each. This takes in a callback function. And I'm just going to call it text in here for the value. And what we're going to do is for each of the textures that are in this array, I then want to adjust the UV scale. So I'm going to say text.uScale, and we're going to be using that same value from up above, which is UVScale. And then text.vScale. Okay, once again, let's jump back into the browser. Okay, and it's looking much, much better. Okay, so now we have a nice ground texture. Let's take a look at the sphere next. So for the sphere, we're going to be using our other method. Let's jump up to the very top. Let's uncomment out the ball material section. And we'll go down here and uncomment out this as well. Now, we've already gone through the process of creating all of this already. So I am going to go a little bit faster. So we need to create a material. We're going to be setting up the same thing as up above here with the UV scale and the texture array. And then we're going to be assigning similar textures. So we're going to have the same diffuse texture, normal, the AO text, and the specular texture as well. And then we're going to take a look at a few other things as well with this to modify it in regards to the specularity. Okay, so we create a material. Again, the naming of this doesn't really matter. I call it ball mat just to be consistent. And this is a standard material. We provide a name, and then we assign it to this.scene. I'm going to return ball mat. And now we're going to be creating a couple of things. We need to create the variable at the very top for the UV scale. And I'm going to set this down to a value of 3 for now. We're going to be using a different texture, so the scaling might be a little bit different. We're also going to be creating a const array, which will be a texture array. Okay, so let's start off by creating our diffuse texture. Okay, and there we go. All right, so we're done with all this. Let's make sure that we did assign it up above. So the ground material is getting its material from the create ground material method, and the ball material is coming from the create ball material. Let's take a look at what we have so far. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in a bit on the sphere here, and I'm using the arrow keys to move around. Now, it's a little bit hard to see maybe in the video, but you should see that we do have the impressions, these little diamonds that are going inward. On the stone, that's probably happening as well, but it's not as noticeable. So with this texture, we actually need to invert the normal map. The normal map is sometimes inverted, which creates this kind of effect where it looks like it's embedded. So let's go back into our texture and let's take a look at how we can do that. Okay, so let's go back into the create ball material method. And the way that we would modify this is by modifying a property within the material itself. So since it's part of the normal map, I'm going to be doing it right here. So right after I assign the bump texture, I'll say ball mat dot and just type in invert, and you should find one for X and Y. So we want to use both of these, and both of these are Booleans. So we'll set both of these to true. Make sure that you do this for both of them because the normal map uses the X and the Y to create that kind of fake lighting effect. So set that to invert for the Y axis as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this now. And now you can see that they are sticking out, which is good. Now, if you want to adjust the tiling or the scale of this, we can go back in and adjust the UV scale. So right now at the very top, the UV scale is set to 3. Now, if we didn't set up the array and set up the UV scale property here, what would happen is that we would have to adjust the UV scale for each individual texture by ourselves. But since it's based off this UV scale and the array, I can go in and just modify this directly and save this, and I'm done with the UV scale. So let's take a look at what we have now. Okay, so now it's much bigger. It looks pretty good. And you can see with the normal map, even though it's not actually creating any kind of geometry, we do get the lighting effects that are affecting it. Now, like I mentioned before, we do want to play around with the specularity. So the specular power will allow us to adjust how much the shadows here and the lighting is affected. So it's going to allow us to basically focus in that shine effect. So let's jump back into our code and let's add in the specular power. So again, back in the create ball material, go down to where you have your specular texture. I like to keep everything organized based on what it's doing. So right after we assign the specular texture, I'm going to say ball mat dot specular, and we have specular texture. Just scroll up a bit, and you'll see specular power. Specular power is a number. So I'm going to go and set this to a value of 10, and then we'll play around with this as need be. So by setting this to 10, it should look a little bit brighter, a little bit crisper. Okay, so right away we can see it does look brighter overall. And I'm using a bit of an extreme value, but you can see the difference with that. So let's go back in and let's adjust it down to 1. And let's see what that does. Okay, so with a value of 1, you can see it almost looks dried out, almost washed out, like the colors have been faded away. But here we can fine tune it so we can use both the specular texture and also that numerical value. Now, if you didn't have a specular texture, what would happen with the specular power is that you would get a uniform look on the sphere. You wouldn't be able to use the texture as a way of kind of masking out which portions are going to be brighter versus darker. Okay, so take a look around what we have so far. Now we have a nice little sphere that has a nice diamond plate texture applied to it. We have our ground object, which also has a nice cobblestone effect. Now these are basic textures. In our next video, we're going to be going over how to use a PBR material, which is going to allow us to create much more realistic looking environments. We're going to be able to use the environment lighting to affect the textures. With our standard materials, this is great for any kind of basic coloring of your scene. So if you want basic textures, basic coloring, just use a standard material. But in our next video, we'll be going over how to really amplify our look by using a PBR material.